Tom, welcome to the show. You have a unique niche here for our audience talking about podcasting, and I think a lot of value. So why don't you let them know a little bit about your background, and then we'll dive in.
Well, thanks, David. And I guess I proved that you can do podcasting and specifically podcast guesting from anywhere, right? I'm in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Yes, it really does exist. And years ago, back in about 2008, I used inbound marketing. So using guest blogs to attract, engage, and delight customers. So how we built up a company from being a regional player to a national leader, sold that one off. And then back in 2014, I sort of looked at it and thought, I bet you could do podcast guesting much the same way we used to use guest blogging to get introduced to other audiences, to get that respect, the know, like, and trust. So we started to test that. It worked so well. We started an agency. Early on, I thought we started this way too early, but it gave us the foundation. And when podcasting took off, really our business took off. So we've been doing this now 8 years. We serve about 200 clients, have a team of 35 in Europe and North America. And we really believe that work is what you do, not where you go.
Cool. Well, and I like the name Interview Valet. Great name. And didn't you recently release a book? Talk about the book a little bit.
So there's been 2 books that I've written. And the first one was called Podcast Guest Profits, How to Grow Your Business with the Targeted Interview Strategy. And that was sort of the playbook. That was this is how we do it. This is how you can do it too. And as I looked back on it, it was like all of the tactics. And while it very, very helpful, very, very powerful, Simon Sinek says, start with why. And my second book was The Why, which is really one conversation away. And really, it comes from this marketing idea that I keep hearing, that you're just one funnel away. And there's an importance for automation and all the rest of that. But nothing good in my life has ever come through a funnel, right? It's always conversations. That new customer that you have, that new partner. Heck, my bride, she did not come through a funnel after all 3 billion women came through and I found that one. No, she was introduced through a conversation through a friend. And I think going forward, that's something that's so important that we have to remember as managers, as business leaders, as humans, that automation is great, but we can't replace conversations and meaningful conversations. And that's why I think people like podcasts so much.
So what you guys are doing is you're taking people, they can be business leaders, other type of leaders, authors, whatever, and you are connecting them with podcasts that align with what they want to talk about so they can get on that podcast and then be known by a broader audience, get to meet new people, that type of thing.
Exactly. And we believe that obscurity is your biggest problem, right? Right now, no matter what product you have, you could be version 1.0. There are still hundreds or thousands of people that would gladly give you money. There's people on their knees praying right now for what you'd have to offer. The problem is they don't know you exist. So we work with nonfiction authors, coaches, consultants, brands. Our mission is to personally introduce inspiring thought leaders to millions of people they could serve for the betterment of all. And so these thought leaders are coming to us with something that could really help the host, help the audience, help the world. And we help them prepare for the podcast interview. We find the right interviews. We even work with them on how to have a system that moves people from just being, a passive listener to an active visitor to their site, and then ultimately an engaged lead. Early on, we had a client that said, I love working with you because you let me be the guest and you take care of the rest. And I'm like, oh, that's good copy. I'm taking that one.
Yeah, it's good. So, and I appreciate the guests you guys send to us. And, a lot of times we go with who you recommend. Sometimes we don't. And how do you find the podcasts that have a reasonably good sized audience and the host is, reasonably good at carrying on a conversation? I mean, you just did this big report on podcasts, and I think it said, what was the number? It's like 2.4 million, 2.663, 691 podcasts are out there. And then 413,204 are active. But I mean, out of all those, just the active ones, 400,000 plus, how do you identify the podcast you're like, hey, this would be a good podcast for us to consider for guests?
Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science, and a little bit of experience. So with that, we license about a dozen different databases, and every one tells us something different. We also have been doing this for so long that we've got an internal database, and we're always talking to the hosts, right? So your podcast relationship manager is talking to you, and you say, hey, I'm looking for this, or I want to go in this direction. We keep all of those notes. We also, back before COVID, you would see us at all of the podcasting conferences. So we actually knew who the hosts were. We talked with them. And, there's a lot of people out there pitching. And I laugh because I get pitched to be on my podcast probably about 3 or 4 times a day. They all love my show and want to be a guest. The problem is I don't have a podcast. It's like robo pitches. So we have banned that word. Pitching in our company is a 4-letter word. And I know where it comes from. You pitch an idea, but I believe you introduce a human being. So, there's a lot of data that goes into it, but it's a lot of human interaction too. Like I said, we've got 35 people on our team. And before your podcast relationship manager reaches out to you for an introduction or a suggestion, there's at least 2 people on the team that have looked at it. So your manager has looked at it and said, oh, this would be great for Manage to win. And also the client account manager representing the client looks at it and says, oh yeah, this would be good for the client too. So there's a lot of checks and balances in there too.
So are there ever podcasts where your client has to pay to be on the podcast? I mean, we certainly don't do that, but are there ones like that, but you're still contacting them because of the size of their audience or something like that?
We typically stay away from those, and that's based on legal counsel. There's a intellectual property entertainment lawyer out there, Gordon Firemark. He's at all the big podcasting conferences, and he's raised the concern in the industry numerous times that, podcasters have the right to monetize their show, and God love them. They do a whole lot of work. But if it is pay to play, there has to be a disclaimer at the front and the end per Federal Trade Commission, right? Almost like you'd see on TV or radio that we've all gotten used to there. So because of that, we don't do it, and we advise our clients, to speak with this lawyer if they've got any questions.
Okay. And then how do you discern, what are the attributes of a great podcast host? Here, you can coach me. You can give me feedback.
Well, first of all, let's step back there and say, what's the attributes of a great podcast, right? And one of those is the podcast host, right? So the first one is the podcast itself, right? Does it have your ideal audience? Is it conversational? Is the host interesting, right? And you can listen to those. And I always say that the best interviews today are not interviews, they're conversations, right? We're talking about the same thing now as if we were sitting down having a cup of coffee. So is it a quality and an engaging conversation that is not only timely, but timeless, right? So that's the podcast itself. The second thing we look at is, the website, the show notes. Do they have those? Because that can help with the discoverability, right? Not all podcasts have that. I mean, I know you do a lot of work at your site, so you put a post up for every guest there, and that's where a lot of people will find the shows from. So we look at the podcast, the website. The next thing we look at is the reach. How many people are going to hear this? And that doesn't just mean estimated downloads, but it's social media. How much are they promoting it? Is it the right social media? Do they have an email list that they're promoting to? And then finally, brand affinity, right? People judge you by the company you keep. And, there's a lot of podcasts out there, and I call them Wayne's World podcasts, right? You and I are both old enough to remember Wayne's World, like 2 guys in their mom's basement. And if you're doing, B2B corporate sales, right? And you've got big deals that you're doing and you want to be a professional, you sure don't want somebody checking you out just before they, sign the contract and find you on a podcast that isn't consistent with your brand. I'll give you an example on this one. We were working with a company, and they were doing the tour before they went public, and they were going out there and everything, and they wanted to get exposure on podcasts. They were doing the road tour there, and I was talking to the CEO, and he said, "Yeah, my assistant was just talking, and she thought like I should be on Joe Rogan's podcast." And I'm like, "You ever listen to Rogan's podcast?" And he's like, "No." I'm like, "Well, Elon Musk was on there about 2 weeks ago, and it caused the Tesla stock to drop." And he looked at me funny. I'm like, "Yeah, Rogan passed him a joint, right? No judgment, right? It's legal in California and stuff like that." But I said the investors didn't like it, and the stock went down. And there was just this silence. And he's like, "And that's why you're picking the podcast and my assistant is not."
Yeah, my son Jeff, who works with me, loves Rogan, and he does he has some great guests and good conversations, but he is very unconventional with foul language, eating on the show, drinking, smoking a joint, whatever it might be. It's just that's his style,
And he's more popular than heck most of the networks out there, right? But the question is it consistent with your brand? And sometimes we know background stuff. Like I always think there's a great podcast called Business Leadership Series with Derek Champagne. And often we'll tell people if they're like going after consumer product goods, I'm like, "This would be a great podcast for you." And they're like, "Why?" And I said, "Because it's simulcast and, on the radio in Bentonville, Arkansas. So if you don't like country and Western and you're listening to the talk radio station there, you're listening to the Business Leadership Series. And if they're doing consumer products, they know Bentonville, Arkansas is the home of Walmart. And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's a market that I want to get heard in."
That's funny. So you're booking these interviews for people, and when they're signing up with you, how many podcasts are they typically signing up to do per month?
Mm-hmm. We always advise them, don't do less than 2 a month, right? Because our clients have told us that when they do less than 2, it's like reinventing the wheel. The other side that we found is we typically don't advise people to do more than 1 a week. And some people say, "Well, if 1 a week is good, let's do 1 a day," right? And full transparency, like we get paid by the interview. So I would make more money on that. But I always point out that more is not better. Better is better. Why don't you do a better interview once a week? Why don't you do more with the interview as far as repurposing it, promoting it, all the rest of that? Had someone that came to me last year, and I still remember this. She said that she wanted to do 100 interviews in the month of June. And I'm like, "Why?" "Oh, because, I want to be famous. I want to be a celebrity, all the rest of that." And it's almost, I in my picture, I tried to explain it to her, but in my mind, it was like, I want to get married, right? So I'm going to do, 100 dates this month, right? It's not, that's not how it works. It's quality over quantity. And we've seen some people, actually hurt themselves because they don't go through that algorithm we talked about, the podcast, the website, the reach, and the affinity. And they just go out and get on lots and lots of podcasts. And then they come up to a respectable podcast. And, the host Googles you really quick. And they're like, "Yeah, they've been on some podcasts that, make them look like they're, a C-rate player. I really don't want to talk with them."
Yeah, I have to admit that I do not Google or look at a prior interview of every proposed guest, but sometimes I do. And I have had it happen that, I do not remember the person. I do not remember the podcast they were on, but I looked at the podcast and the host was, in my estimation, weak. And that led to the guest not sounding very strong. And or contributed to, or maybe the guest just wasn't that strong. I don't know. But I did not go with that guest just because I thought no, if he's on this podcast, and maybe it was a she, I don't really remember. It doesn't seem like it's a good fit.
Yeah, and the partners that we're working with, they expect us and they appreciate it that we vet the guest, right? There was a financial advisor out there making the circuit that if you Googled him, you would find out that he pleaded guilty to a Ponzi scheme in a plea deal, right? But yet he was still out there on podcasts. There's other people there that may make claims that if you go on the internet, you find out they aren't that way. And I'll never forget, there was a producer of one of the big networks that I always remember him saying, he's like, if we have someone on, and it's a Christian network. He's like, if I have someone on and then all of a sudden we find out that they're on a sex offenders list or something like that. He's like, somebody loses their job. And he says, that's me. And so this network, they vet everybody. And one of the things that they mentioned to us is that they realize that we vet our clients too. We do the background so that we're proud to represent them.
Yeah, it's a big thing. So then you're working with these clients and some of them know how to have a conversation and some of them don't. So do you guys do any coaching on that or training?
We do. And I would say both ways, right? Because we have worked with some people that they sound like college professors. You ask them one question and they're going to keep talking until the bell rings, right? And so all of our clients that we do, we give them feedback on the interviews. If they've done previous ones, we'll give them feedback before they even start going out for the next one. I do a walkthrough interview with everyone. So not to practice their content, but just the best practices for podcasts. So for some people, it's slow down. For some people, reminding them it's a conversation. Other people pick up on the verbal cues. It doesn't have to be a 45-minute answer. But what's interesting is we had one gentleman, cybersecurity analyst on one of the big networks. And this guy is so tight, right? He can answer anything in sound bites. He's perfect for television. And then he'd get on a podcast. You'd ask him a question. He would have the perfect 30-second soundbite, and had to go to him and like, Morgan, you're killing me, right? This is a 45-minute interview. You're going to have to tell more stories with, because he could be more relaxed in the conversations. So yeah, we do coaching because we want to make sure that people know the medium and understand the medium.
Yeah, that is the thing that I run into the most with guests. And they can be great guests and we can have a wonderful conversation, but they won't tell a story. So you took a little while to warm up and start giving stories, but you could use this podcast as an example of how you blended conversation with story. I mean, now you've been hitting like story after story after story. And, we had to do the intro and some different things. And I'm talking candidly for our audience. Okay. I could save this for afterwards, but this is where it really comes together. I had a guest just recently, great energy level, very intelligent, hit on his points. We had a really good conversation afterwards. By the way, I never give feedback unless they ask. You didn't ask, but I'm giving it anyway because you're talking about you're the expert. So, but he asked me at the end, anything I could have done that would have been better. So I told him. I said, you did a great job. We had a good conversation, but you didn't tell a single story. And I told you before we started, our best interviews, they tell good stories. And he says, well, I wasn't really sure how to do it without sounding salesy or what I've said. Well, here's 3 stories you could have given. You could have given this example and brought across this type of point. I don't have the data, but, and I walked him through 3 things. And, and then other times I'd say about 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 guests, they're just not as strong as I had hoped. And typically those guests don't ask me at the end, how did I do? What could I have done better? So I don't say anything.
Well, guarantee you, any client that we send to you, we're asking afterwards because we're getting the feedback both from the host and the guest, right? Because we want to get better. We want our clients to get better. And, there's some things that they don't know, and maybe the host wouldn't tell them. Like I can think one time there was a gentleman and he had a window behind him He closed the drapes behind him, right? And I don't know if it was shears on a sunny day, but David, it was a video interview. And afterwards, the host told us, yeah, it looked like there was a ghost walking behind him. It was really distracting. And I don't know if somebody was cutting his lawn or whatever, but we were able to pass that on to the guests. They were mortified, but it never happened again. So yeah, we're always trying to improve.
Yeah. And that's a great thing. And I think that, in this era where, the internet's there, I can go online. I can search how to be on podcasts. I can search how to be a great guest. I can try to figure out some podcasts I want to be on. But, you look at the ROI of a return. Now we haven't done this yet, okay, where we've hired an organization like yourself, and then we've gone out and started to be on podcasts. But I just encourage the audience, if you're thinking about being on podcasts, I mean, it's a natural to call like Interview Valet, you and your team, to get some help, because you guys have been there, done that. And the small amount of money, relatively small, I mean, everything's money, but relatively small amount of money we're going to pay you to guide us is going to come back tenfold, month by month, because you're going to get us on better podcasts. You're going to help us be better guests. Particularly, I work with a number of organizations like you guys. You're the only one that sent me, how did the guests do? Give us feedback. So that's the type of team I want working for me, because not only am I going to ask at the end of the podcast, how did I do? But my team's going to ask, and you may get different feedback.
And at the end of the day, the goal is not, can you get me on a podcast interview? Right? Like you said, there's 2.6 million podcasts out there. Getting on one is not the challenge. It's getting on the right one and then doing it in such a way that it meets your goals, to build your brand and your business. And, we sit down with our prospective clients from the very beginning, learn about their business, and then we take it back to our leadership team and say, hey, what could we do for David? And we'll give you a plan and say, this is what it would look like. Here's our initial ideas on that. We're not trying to sell anyone, right? There's a great book out there by Derek Sivers called Heck Yes. And I love how he looks at life. He says there's two answers in life. There's heck yes and no, right? So let's just give the information, answer the questions. If you can say heck yes, well, then let's move forward. If it's not a heck yes, then that's a no, right? And let's just go on from there. But I'm always amazed that great people that are out there, the great services that could really help a lot of people. The best product or service is not the one that gets chosen. It's the one that's the best of the known ones, right? So it could be somebody else that's known. They're not as good, but hey, that's what they'll go with. And I pinch myself sometimes. It's like, how didn't I know about this? How didn't other people know about this? And it's one of the great things about podcasts.
And people like to listen, while they're driving, while they're doing whatever. They do like to listen. And, as you move from host to host, the host should vary the conversation. So there should be some different interaction there, or whether you have different stories you're going to bring to different podcasts. And then the beauty about podcasts is you put it on your own website, you put it on your own social media. The podcast company's done all the production work for you. Okay. So that's a great thing, and it's a win-win. It's a great way to have people get to know you and what you do.
Well, and you said it, and I always feel guilty for it, right? Because people will say, you've been on over 1,200 podcast interviews. Why don't you have your own podcast? And honestly, it's because doing a podcast is a lot of work, right? I show up for this, we talk, then I leave. And then David and his team go and they edit it. They put the beginning, the end on it. They put it up there. They make the graphics, everything else. And it's like, I'm an engineer, right? So return on investment, how can I get more out and put less in? That's more of the guesting side of it. And also it's a huge commitment, right? You've got to do it week in, week out. And I just have never had that level of a commitment, right? There's a reason that I don't have a tattoo, right? I'm not sure that I want to have that forever. And like with the podcast, it's like majority of podcasts die after the first 10 episodes, right? You're almost to 150 now. That's unheard of, right? Very, very few get to 100, right? And so I tell a lot of people, unless you're ready and you know that you're going to do this for a couple of years, you may not want to start your own podcast. Why don't you go out and go on other people's podcasts and try that for a while?
Well, actually, we did 50 that were no bad bosses before we did the Manage to Win podcast. So we're actually approaching 200. Wow. And we still have those live. And I did like those. It had a negative tinge to it by saying no bad bosses. And we had the bad bosses in a red circle with a slash, the red slash.
Yep.
Like, don't do this. I always loved that. I still do. We still have some buttons left over that are like that. But yeah, it's been a journey and we enjoy it. And probably sometime later this year, we're going to shift to where we're going to want to be on other podcasts. And we may do that, quite frankly, as my son and I, because we are a father-son team, where we say, hey, let's get us both on there, because we come at the business from different angles. And I think it'll be a good conversation. But I encourage people to, visit your site, interviewvalet.com, Tom, and see what you guys got going. Don't you also have like a free copy of your book or something like you can offer people?
I do. And thank you. So when I get in here, it's not to sell a book or anything, right? If you want a copy of the book, I'll make a page. It's just interviewvalet with a v.com/M, the number 2, and then W. And I'll put free copy of the book there. If you're in the States, I'll send you a physical copy. If you're outside, send you a digital copy. There's a little assessment that we have, answer 10 questions, whether or not podcast interview marketing will work for you. And then, if we can be of any service, if you just want to talk with somebody and say, how would this look? I'll put my calendar scheduling link on there too. So over at interviewvalet.com/M, the number 2, and then W.
That's cool. Thank you so much, Tom. I think this has been good. It's a great addition. We work with a lot of leaders, and I think this would be great for people to consider to add to what they're doing.
Well, thank you. Appreciate everything you do, David, and stay strong. The world needs to hear you now more than ever.